Glory to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. This video is the continuation now of the period towards after the Maccabean revolt during the Hasmonean period of the Judeans, but also now this video will also discuss the rise of the Roman Republic. Now the Roman Republic, at this point, I went back a little bit to around 350 BC, just a little bit before the time of Alexander the Great, only because just to point out now, because now we can include now the Western Mediterranean just in this discussion now, and Italy, because now remember, as I said in some of the earlier videos when it came to the Western Mediterranean, remember we had originally Greek colonies in the Western Mediterranean, and then Carthaginian colonies in the Western Mediterranean. And Carthage, of course, was originally the colony of the Phoenicians. So these Carthage already now had a very long history at this point, several hundred years since its founding, its founding was around 814, 815 BC, around there, by Dido of Carthage. And of course, Rome itself was founded at around 753 BC. Now, the difference was that Rome, though, even though it had existed for several hundred years, it only existed as the city of Rome, where the area around it was controlled by the Etruscans. And the area that's, well, there's nobody labeled here, but the area in white here would be the other Italic tribes related to the Latins, or the original Romans. And of course, the yellow on this map are the Greek colonies in southern Italy and in the eastern part of Carthage. I'm sorry, the eastern part of Sicily, where like places like Syracuse were, which was a Greek colony, and the western part of Sicily belonged to was a colony of Carthage. So now the Romans stay quiet for all those centuries, and nothing really changes in the Western Mediterranean. The Western Mediterranean is pretty quiet during this time for several hundred years. It was the Eastern Mediterranean where basically the action was. Now, of course, by the time of Alexander the Great, we have, of course, the destruction of the Persian Empire. So Alexander, around 330s BC, then, of course, goes on his campaign against the Persians and completely destroys and conquers the Persian Empire. And then Alexander dies in 323 BC, and then the empire that he inherits sort of gets divvied up within the next 20 years among his four generals. But of course, we know that it's the two parts: the Greek Egypt, the Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Greek Seleucid Empire, become basically the two most stable of the post-Alexander Hellenistic kingdoms. So, but now during this time, from the time of the rise of Alexander, if we notice, the Romans were also expanding through Italy. Now, this is not a coincidence, because this is all, remember, because it goes back to the prophet Daniel in the book of Daniel, where remember we had where the archangel Gabriel showed the prophet Daniel the prophecy of the upcoming empires, which he saw as, of course, because it was during the Babylonian exile, he saw it as the Persians, and then the coming of the Greeks and Alexander the Great, and then the coming of the Romans. So it's actually, everything is actually happening literally like clockwork, according to the book of Daniel, and the way the Lord commanded the archangel Gabriel to communicate to the prophet Daniel. So we have here, during now the Hellenistic period, of everything that the last few videos have discussed in the East. Now, if we could focus now on the Western Mediterranean. I'll try to zoom in a little. We have, of course, now the Romans conquering the other Italian tribes like the Umbrians and the Samnites, which are very famous wars historically, like the Samnite War. And then, of course, the overthrow of the Etruscans through the 200s BC. So in the East, this would be around the time of Maccabees 3. This will also be around the time of the the a translation of the Septuagint in Alexandria. So during this period in Italy, the Romans are basically taking over much of Italy, um, with the exception of the Greek areas and the areas controlled by Carthage. Now, for a while during this period, the Romans do not. Oops, I went a little too far. The Romans do not engage the Greeks or the Carthaginians because they were probably they didn't want to incur also basically a retaliation from the Greeks early on and from Carthage, where they would have been much stronger than the Romans in at least in the beginning. But as Rome becomes very powerful, uh, of course, inevitably they come into conflict with the Greeks of southern Italy and the Carthaginians. Now, when it comes to Rome's government, going back to around 509 BC, the Romans had overthrown their original monarchy. So the Romans, when they were just a small kingdom just around the city of Rome, in the land of Latium, the area around where Rome is, um, they had a monarchy, but they overthrew that monarchy and then established what became known as their republic, controlled by a representative council or high council of sorts, which they referred to as their Senate. The Senate, as their governing body, was basically their governing authority. So they were a republic. They didn't have a single king at this point. Uh, and remember, around the time when they had overthrown their king, going back, going way back to around 509 BC. Remember, the Greeks had done the same thing. The Athenians had done something similar when they established their democracy, and in a few other places, very similar things had happened. Interestingly, when the Romans did that and established their republic originally, that was also the same time as the end of the Babylonian exile for the Judeans, as the Second Temple was being rebuilt. In the time of the books, in the Old Testament scriptures, it would be in the time of the books of Ezra, 1 and 2 Ezra, or Esdras in Greek. So we see um, now the Romans are expanding through Italy. Um, Now around the time of 280, uh, um, Rome comes into conflict with this state here in that would be around in northwestern Greece called Epirus. Now Epirus was a small kingdom. It was considered to be one of like the Hellenistic kingdoms, but really among the smallest. It was in an area that today is partially Greece, right next to the island Corfu or Kerkyra in Greek today, and partially in what's now like southern Albania. But the Epirus, it was a Greek kingdom. Um, it was its own kingdom with its own monarch. It was separate from Macedonian rule and from the other Greeks of the Hellenistic world. It was kind of on its own, but they had also had colonies because of their location very close to southern Italy. They had also had a lot of colonies in Italy, and actually they had actually kind of taken over a lot of southern Italy from the Greeks that were from other places in Greece that they had kind of seized it. So Epirus was a little bit aggressive when it came to southern Italy against the other Greeks actually. So when Epirus starts to invade around 280, so I stopped it here around 280 BC. When they start to invade southern Italy to seize the Greek colonies of southern Italy, the Romans react and the Romans go to war with Epirus. Now the king of Epirus at the time, his name was Pyrrhus, like Pyrrhus, Pyrrhus. And Pyrrhus of Epirus actually fought between 280 and 279 two very large battles, but it's a very famous war called the Pyrrhic War, and it was a quite large war actually, and Pyrrhus actually won against the Romans. The problem was that Pyrrhus had depleted his army and his resources so much that he really, in all essence, actually lost. And even in modern day parlance, where you get the term a Pyrrhic victory is where the victor basically loses because because the war is so devastating or so drawn out and uses so many resources that basically even if the winner wins and is the victor in the war, that basically it's tantamount to basically losing because they didn't really accomplish anything. So that's really what happens with Pyrrhus. But for Rome, it actually becomes even though Rome eventually, within the next years, actually seizes much of southern Italy, the mainland of Italy, because after the Pyrrhic War, Rome, the Roman Republic, starts to fear the Greeks much less. Where before they kind of feared incurring the Greeks coming together against them, they were kind of not afraid of the Greeks anymore. So the Romans start to now do what they want in this area. So they conquer the Greeks of southern Italy, but now the other power that they have to contend with now is Carthage. And remember, Carthage was extremely wealthy because remember, the Carthaginians had benefited from trade. Now remember, well, if you know the climate of this area, the northern part of what's now, this would be modern day Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. The northern parts, of course, are very Mediterranean in climate and vegetation. It looks like Greece or like southern Italy and Sicily. But as you go into the interior, it becomes the Sahara Desert, which is, of course, barren and extremely desolate. Aside from some of the tribes, like the Berber tribes and the ancient Tuareg that lived within the desert. And they used to trade then going south of the desert, because once you get beyond the deep Sahara Desert, it will transition into the African savanna eventually. And then, of course, it's more populated by the African tribes as you go into the savanna. But there was trade between the tribes within West Africa, which is, of course, now is tropical, of course, once you get to these areas. And caravans that went across the Sahara Desert into towards the Mediterranean. And within this area, some of the Berber tribes, it doesn't really show it here, but there were Berber tribes like the Numidians who were actually quite wealthy. And they had also traded through this area with Carthage. So Carthage was very wealthy, and the city Carthage was an enormous city with an enormous port, which was actually world famous at the time. And then Carthage also had established its own colonies in Hispania. Now, Hispania, or modern day, where modern day Spain and Portugal is today, um, it was a kind of a cultural mix of people where you would have had the Celtic tribes that for many centuries had lived here, the Ibero-Celtic tribes. Then you had the Iberians, who were an older, pre-Celtic, predated the Celts and the Celt-Iberians. And then you have also in the north, you would have had the people related to the modern day Basque people that were still living in the same area at the same time. Uh, but then of course you have the Carthaginian element, and the Carthaginians established another city called Carthage in Spain, which later, of course, in which continues on its name even in modern times, because even in Spanish to this day it's called Cartagena. And interestingly, even going into the Americas, in South America, there's the city Cartagena in the country of Colombia. But anyway, that name is coming from Cartagena, Spain, which is coming originally from Carthage, which was the ancient Phoenician colony. And of course, Carthage meant new city in Phoenician, Kiryat Hadashat. So I guess the Carthage in Hispania would have been the new city. But anyway, before I digress too much, when it gets to now the conflict between Rome and Carthage, that's when we get three very large wars called the Punic Wars. Punic because the Carthaginians were sometimes referred to as being Punic. It's another form of the word Phoenician, because Phoeniki in Greek, in the Carthaginian language would have been Punim, which in Latin was like Punic. So that's where the word Punic is coming from. It's just another name culturally of the ethnic Carthaginians. And so the Romans and the Carthaginians end up now fighting a very long war with, well, three wars called the Punic Wars. Uh, the first Punic War was from around 264 BC to around 241 BC. So I'll just move a little bit toward that time. Um, and we see actually during the First Punic War, Rome actually wins, and Rome takes control of all of Sicily. The Carthaginian part of Sicily comes under Roman control. The Greek part with Syracuse remains under the Greeks. And I thought it's not showing it. Ah, yes, because they also take Sardinia and Corsica uh, during the First Punic War. So here's now the beginning of the Roman Republic's expansion outside of the mainland boot of Italy, on these three islands. Now, in the Second Punic War is from around 214 BC to around 146 BC. Now, that war is very important because during that war, um, that's when Rome really expands um, outside of Italy towards Iberia. Um, oh, actually, excuse me, I made a mistake. I meant to say that the Second Punic War was from around 218 to around 201 BC, not all the way to 146 BC. That was after the Third Punic War. Um, but the Second Punic War, in between now the Romans and Carthage, it's very important because now the Greeks get involved. Because now there was a sort of but even after the First Punic War, there was somewhat of a status quo between the Romans and the Carthaginians and the Greeks. Now remember, the dynamic among the Greeks was that within the Greeks in the time during the Hellenistic period, during the time of uh, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, the Greek city-states had tried to, which and successfully they did many times, wrestle control away from Macedonian rule and or any other the rule from the larger Hellenistic kingdoms at the time. So there were times when they were free of it, and the Greeks had city-states had formed basically alliances between each other called leagues, which they had even going before Alexander the Great. But the final two are the Achaean League and the Aetolian League. The Achaean League would have included certain city-states like Corinth and Athens, the more powerful Greek city-states, and the Aetolian League would have considered the more minor ones that were not so powerful, like in Western Greece. But both of them would have been against Macedonian rule and trying to keep themselves independent, especially the Spartans. Like I said in previous videos, that the Spartans did not want to be under anybody. So the Romans, seeing this dynamic, tried to exploit it, basically. So now, what the Romans did not want in their conflict with Carthage was for the Greeks, any of the Greeks, whether it was the Greek city-states themselves or any of the other Greek kingdoms, to come to the aid of Carthage and to side with Carthage. So the Romans kind of played the Greeks against each other. And actually it worked, because what happens is that the Romans end up kind of allying themselves with the Achaean League, so with the Greek city-states, against Macedonia, because the other Greeks would have seen, especially Macedonia itself, the Greek Macedonia, as a threat, basically, because it was Macedonia that had tried to take them over repeatedly, even when they tried to throw off Macedonian rule. So the Greek city-states would sometimes try to ally with the Greeks Ptolemaic Egypt, or with the other Greeks like the Seleucids at times. But for the most part, they didn't want to ally with them too much, so they saw the Romans as a potential ally against the Macedonians. So now the Romans go to war at the same time, around the same time as the Second Punic War. The Romans are actually fighting on two fronts now. They're fighting against the Macedonians and Epirus, but allied with the Achaeans. And then they're fighting against Carthage, because the Romans figure that as long as they're keeping the Greeks busy and sort of like having them fight each other, or allowing them to kind of fight each other, or an ally with the Greek city-states, they're not going to come to the aid of Carthage. because the Romans wanted to isolate Carthage and keep them away from the Greeks. So, well, the Second Punic War, I went a little far, but well, we see that now the Second Punic War also is the very famous battle where Hannibal, the general Hannibal of Carthage, actually marched from, oh, here's Carthago Novo, it's actually right here, actually marched from New Carthage in Hispania with a contingent of war elephants and marched all the way across, going all the way into Gaul, passing by all these Celtic tribes with elephants, and then going all the way down the Alps with the elephants and attacking Rome. And in the end, of course, Rome though wins, and Rome takes control of the Carthaginian possessions in Hispania and many parts of North Africa as we get past uh, well, maybe not North Africa at this point, but at least Hispania at this point, and then going further up into like the area that's much farther north in Italy, like where the Alps is. Um, now, um, then we get to the third. Now, remember, also the Romans, as you could see, gain a foothold in the area right to the north of Epirus. This foothold that they have here in the east is where they launch their then attack against first the Macedonians, and then, well, something else also happens that I'll get to in a minute. But as we move forward now we move forward um, to now the Third Punic War, now going to around the 140s. Whoops, all right, well, the 160s, let's say, um, because it's happening. Well, now the Third Punic War is in the 140s BC, but during this period, the Romans in the 160s BC are focusing now on the Greeks. Now, here, the Romans fight a very famous war between Epirus and the Macedonians. I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but basically, obviously, the Romans win and conquer the Macedonians and conquer Epirus around this period, a little bit before 160 BC. Now, when this happens, the Greek leagues, the Greek city-states are like, uh-oh, because they just realized that they made a very big boo-boo, because by allying with the Romans, now the Romans have conquered Macedonia and many parts of northern Greece, and they know that now that they're next. And then basically now it's too little too late, because now the Romans have conquered Thessaloniki, this entire area. So once this happens, there's now the war between the Greeks, and a very bitter war between the Greek city-states now. The Aetolian League and the Achaean League, who are like the last alliance now of the Greek city-states against now the Romans coming in and conquering them. Now remember, this is all happening at the same time as the Maccabean revolt. If we look at the dates, the Maccabean revolt with the Judeans against the Seleucids was happening at around the same time. So remember, all these things are not a coincidence. Because now the time is coming, according to the prophet Daniel, once Greece is conquered, that now this is now the rise of Rome as now the next anti-authority, as we understand, like from the Orthodox Christian perspective, the next worldly empire now coming in, according to the prophet Daniel. So of course, as time goes on, now around 149 BC, we have now the Third Punic War, and then of course in the Third Punic War, Carthage is completely destroyed around 146 BC. And then the Greeks are also conquered in 146 BC. Now remember, one of the things that also makes Rome very powerful is that, remember, initially the Romans were not a seagoing people. It was the Carthaginians and the Greeks were the seagoing people. But the Romans learn during the First and the Second Punic War, they learned from the Carthaginians to build a fleet. So then by this point, Rome now has a powerful navy at this point. So now the Romans are a powerful state, obviously, at this point. Now we're getting to around now in the Third Punic War, the Romans crush both the Carthaginians and the Greeks at the same time in the same year in 146 BC. 148, 147, 146 BC, Greece is crushed and Carthage is crushed. And now the capital city, the primary city state in Greece of the Achaean League was Corinth. Corinth is completely destroyed by the Romans. So the Corinth in the time of the holy apostles, when St. Paul goes there, was actually the later rebuilt Corinth in Roman times, in Roman era Greece at that point. But the original Corinth was completely destroyed, and Carthage was completely destroyed. The people were enslaved. I mean, if it was modern times, we would probably consider it to be like a terrible genocide. But many, many thousands and thousands of Carthaginians were massacred by the Romans in the final crushing of Carthage. Now, remember also, it could be also that, remember, as we understand now that when it comes to sovereign nations and the Lord's judgment on those nations, that eventually, like a lot of these nations, remember, were coming to an end because, remember, like, well, in the case of Carthage, remember, the Carthaginians, ethnically and linguistically, and in terms of their paganism, were, remember, the Canaanites going way back because the Phoenicians themselves were the Canaanites. So the Carthaginians, remember, practiced human sacrifice. They sacrificed children in their paganism to their false gods. And remember, even in the names like Hannibal, remember Hannibal, what's the last syllable is the evil demon idol of the Canaanites, the Baal, which is the same as Jezebel. Remember, because Jezebel was related to the Carthaginians. It was actually the same people as her. So even when the Israelites and the Judeans would fall into that paganism, of the child sacrifice, this was the paganism of the Carthaginians as well. And even the pagan Greeks and the Romans, from very early on, describes the rites, the evil pagan rites of the Carthaginians. So when Carthage completely is conquered by the Romans, in many ways we could see that that it was also the end of also their that brand of their paganism at that point. Um, well, the Lord's judgment falling on Carthage. That was their final end. Um, Now, as we get to now moving on, eventually the final kingdom in Western North Africa is the Numidia. The Numidians were a native Berber tribe in this part of North Africa, and eventually they come under Roman rule as well. So by the time of, let's say, the time of the beginning of the Hasmonean period, just through that very brief period that we just went through in 100 years, you could see how the Romans had taken over now pretty much of the Western Mediterranean, and then including Greece. Now, as we move on, going forward, of course, we have now this kingdom that was the kingdom of Pergamon. And remember, Pergamon was ruled by the Attalid dynasty, a powerful, wealthy Greek dynasty. And Pergamon, remember, Pergamon is one of the cities of the seven churches of the Apocalypse. And along with Smyrna, Ephesus, and Pergamon, remember, the Lord says that that's where Satan's throne is. Remember, so Pergamon kind of had this connection because remember, Pergamon itself becomes this kingdom of Pergamon becomes the Roman province of Asia at this point. So this piece now of the Romans now in Asia Minor is because the kingdom of Pergamon, the last of the Attalids, actually hands over peacefully actually to the Romans because I guess he didn't want to just be conquered by the Romans, so he just like, here you go, we give up, we surrender. But he gave it peacefully to the Romans, this peace. Now, the next phase of Roman expansion in the east, now we're only at 125 now BC. So all the way to the Lord's nativity, in the next 125 years is when now everything gets conquered, basically. Now, among the Judeans, remember 140 BC was the time when actually I have a chart that's useful. I'm going to try to bring it up. This chart shows it doesn't show all of the Maccabean brothers, but it shows the ones that had the leadership positions during the time from the time of the Maccabean revolt through going from the Maccabean revolt all the way to the time of the nativity of the Lord and the time of Herod, the wicked Herod. So now, of course, we started with Mattathias, who led the initial revolt, as if you remember from the previous video, around 166 BC. Then his son Judas the Maccabee takes over. And remember, they called themselves ethnarch at this point. And then his brother Jonathan takes over as ethnarch, but also as ethnarch and high priest, which in the beginning worked kind of, but then they become corrupt, but not with these three, because these three, Judas, Jonathan, Simon, are considered righteous. John starts off as righteous, but he goes a little bit off, though. But so we have Judas, Jonathan, and Simon are three of the Maccabee brothers. Then Simon's son John takes over. This is where the book of Maccabees 1 ends. This is like the furthest forward the Maccabees goes in the time of John. But later on, John acquires the nickname Irkanos during the period of when he allies himself with the Seleucids against the Parthians, as the Parthians were at war with the Seleucid Greeks, and John allies and even fights alongside Antiochus the Seventh. And Antiochus the Seventh actually many times shows actually a reverence for the Judeans, actually, and where John Hyrcanos kind of goes off a little bit. So there's an interesting dynamic in that respect. Now, John Hyrcanos ruled from about 134 to 104 BC. Then his son was Aristobulus. Now, his son, now, interestingly, now he has a Greek name at this point. He makes the big mistake of using the title Basileus, not ethnarch. This is when, from Aristobulus onward, the Hasmoneans become very corrupt and degenerate eventually. Then, now Aristobulus, he only ruled for about 1 year, 1 or 2 years, but you can see the damage that he did by using the title Basileus. Now, what happens is that his brother Alexander Jannaeus comes to power from around 103 to 176 BC. Now, Alexander Jannaeus becomes basically a tyrant and a dictator, and using the word king, so like an evil king. And he actually is very corrupt, but now he takes what was the independent Hasmonean, well, quote unquote kingdom now, let's say, but it is independent now, of Judea, where it was only basically the area around Judea, and then he expands and conquers, and he goes on a series of actually violent conquests, and he conquers going up into Samaria, and then up north into the Galilee area, and then south towards the area that was called Idumea, where the last of the Edomites lived, and then going west toward the Mediterranean coast. So Alexander Jannaeus turned the Hasmonean kingdom into a much now larger kingdom. Now that included areas beyond the original Judea, to now include Judea, Samaria, Galilee, and Idumea. And in this, remember, Alexander Jannaeus destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. So if the Samaritans and the Judeans didn't have a good relationship before him, it was much worse after, let's put it that way. That's why I remember in the time of Saint Photini, in the Gospel of Saint John, chapter 4, where our Lord Jesus Christ speaks with Saint Photini at Jacob's well. Remember, she says, "Well, we Samaritans worship on this mountains, but you Judeans say that Jerusalem is where we ought to worship." But she says that the mountain because at that point the Samaritans only used to gather at the temple on Mount Gerizim, the mountain that she's referring to, because the original Samaritan temple was destroyed by Alexander Jannaeus, actually. And then Alexander Jannaeus' widow becomes the quote-unquote queen, and she was actually quite tyrannical. And she's actually the one responsible for actually the power that the Pharisees had in the time now as we move forward. And I'll get to the Pharisees and the sectarianism among the Judeans in a moment, but I just want to just briefly say that we have Alexandra Salome around 76 to 67 BC, and then now their sons, John Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, are involved in a very brutal civil war. Now this civil war is also played out between also the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And now, as the Romans, tying in with the earlier part of this video, as the Romans are coming into this area, the Romans become very much involved in this civil war. And actually, the Romans seize Judea at the conclusion of this civil war, basically. So the Romans take Judea, Hasmonean Judea, and make it pretty much a client, well, pretty much into a client state, and then as they control it pretty much by around 63 BC. And then now Aristobulus the second is the one that kind of is the victorious one in the civil war. And then now his son Antigonus, he has two sons, Antigonus and Alexander. Antigonus now is now under, they're really just like under now Roman rule at this point. But from Antigonus we get, of course, now Alexander had a daughter named Mariamne. Mariamne marries Herod, and that's how Herod comes to power. Now Herod was not of the Hasmoneans. Herod actually was originally an Idumean from when in the time of Alexander Jannaeus, before had conquered the Idumeans. The Judeans had actually kind of forced the Idumeans to be circumcised and to adopt uh, the, 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 the ways of the Judeans at that point. So Herod was actually a convert. His father Antipater, who was an Idumean, and he was also part Nabatean. They were converts actually to the Judeans. But Herod's father was put in charge of the Idumean part region within the Hasmonean kingdom. So after Alexander Jannaeus took over the southern part of what became the Hasmonean kingdom, that's how Herod came in. Herod's father came in, and then Herod weaseled his way into power by then marrying Mariamne. Now, eventually, Herod murders Mariamne, and anybody left of the Hasmonean dynasty, Herod had already had them all murdered already. So this is already several decades before the Nativity. That's why when we get to the time of the Nativity of the Lord, where Herod lived to around 1 or 2 AD, after he massacred the innocents, the holy innocents in Jerusalem, um, when we get to that point, and I'll just stop there because of course, obviously, getting to the point of the Lord's incarnation has to be in a separate video. But just briefly, that's why we see Herod ruling by himself pretty much during that period, because he would have had his in-laws, who were the Hasmoneans, all murdered from already. So that's how Herod comes to power, and how the Hasmoneans basically uh, mess everything up, and everything comes under Roman rule. But of course, I mean, this is of course the prophecy. But going back now to the map and to what was happening. So I just briefly just went over what was happening at this point. Now remember, as the Romans expand into this area, they come into conflict with these kingdoms, Pontus and Nicomedia, in very famous wars, actually, like called the Mithridatic War, after Mithridates of Pontus. In the Mithridatic War between the Romans and the kingdom. Now, the Pontus was Mithridates. Of course, Mithridates is is a Hellenized Persian name, because the Pontians themselves were a mix of like Greeks and Persians, but with a Hellenistic culture at this point. Now, as we move forward, that we would see here, the Pontic kingdom actually becomes very powerful at one point, before the war, and then and even is able to push against the Romans very briefly, but then the Romans push back. This is all during the Mithridatic War. That's why you see this back and forth over here. Now, and also remember, back in Greece, there were actually Greek uprisings at this point against the Romans. But one of the most famous is an Athenian revolt against the Romans that was put down by the very famous Roman general Sulla, who put down the Athenian revolt. But that was a little bit before this. But I'm just briefly going over, because I mean, it's so many details that it would take too long to go through like all the details. But just very briefly. Now around 63 BC, there was a period during this around this time when the Armenians actually become very powerful for a very brief period. Only a few years, the Armenians actually developed their own empire, actually, going all the way from the Armenian heartland right down to Judea. Remember now, this Judea is now, look how big it is. Because if you remember what I just said a few minutes ago, this would be the time when, looking at the Judeans, when you had Alexander Jannaeus, who conquered going up towards Galilee and Samaria and south to the Idumeans. So that's why you see Judea expanding to a much larger size, much larger than the little tiny Judea that it was after the initial Maccabean revolt. Uh, as we move forward, we see that by the time we get to around 63 BC, uh, let me see, around 663 BC, during that period, just right before this, I'm trying to get to this. Let me see. It's fine. The Romans annexed um, what was left of the Seleucids around 63 BC, and also uh, Judea comes under Roman control around the same time. Now, the way that this goes about is through three very important characters that arise among the Romans during this period. Because now we're already up to around the 60s and the 50s. We're actually in the time of Julius Caesar now, actually. And Julius Caesar was actually originally, see, the way the Romans functioned going way back, even during all these wars, like the Punic Wars and all these wars expanding. Remember, they didn't have an actual king or monarch because they just had their senate. But what would happen is that very often they would have military generals that would rise, and they would even elect them as what was called like dictators for brief periods. But they were not monarchs, of course, but they were looked on as being like powerful leaders, obviously, uh, because they would have controlled the army, the legions of the Romans. Now, at around this period, 58 BC, we have a powerful alliance of three powerful generals: Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. This alliance of these three is called a triumvirate, meaning three men in Latin. And basically, this is when Julius Caesar Julius Caesar makes his name at this point because he was a very successful general in the military. So they each kind of like, they're not, I mean, they have a very powerful political power also, this triumvirate. Now, Pompey is the one responsible, at least at this point, with the area in the Middle East. And Pompey is the one who actually invades Syria and seizes Syria. Now, Pompey was also very much involved in the Hasmonean Civil War. Now, if you remember in the Hasmonean Civil War that I mentioned a few moments ago, uh, let me just get back to it really quick. Um, Between John Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, right around this period, Pompey allies, or I should say, Aristobulus allies with Pompey. There's an alliance between the two. And remember, the Hasmoneans had alliances with the Romans going way back, but like the Greeks, because kind of the situation that the Greeks had found themselves in, remember, 100 years earlier. Because remember now, the Greeks in Greece are under the Romans already for about 100 years. But the Romans were very, very sneaky in the way that they played the politics against, where people would ally with them, thinking that they were going to be protected, but then they just end up getting conquered, pretty much. So in the end, it's always that the Romans win at the end during this period. So the same thing happened when the Romans got involved in this Hasmonean civil war. And there's a lot of details, of course, basically, but it's like a big soap opera. But but basically, we have it ends with Aristobulus kind of winning, but uh, Pompey ends up actually during the siege, because the Judeans actually put up a defense against Pompey's invasion of Jerusalem, and Pompey invades Jerusalem and puts even the temple itself under siege, and he's able to actually uh, defeat the Judeans, and that's how Judea gets forcefully kind of put under Roman control. And interestingly, he actually and it's one of the few times somebody like this enters the temple. But unlike Antiochus Epiphanes, he enters the temple, but he doesn't really defile it. I mean, technically, he defiles it just by being there, because he goes right into the Holy of Holies. But he enters it, but doesn't do anything. But then, of course, it still would have had to have been like reconsecrated. But he didn't. It wasn't like he put up any idol or abomination of desolation. But his entering of the temple was a very big offense at that time, at that point. And of course, that was the beginning of now Judea being pretty much absorbed as a Roman province. Uh, so basically, that's why on this map, by around 63 BC, now well, I stopped it at 58 BC, Judea is no longer on the map anymore. It's just subsumed under now the Romans, as the Romans expand. And now the only place after this point, the only place that's really free at this point is Ptolemaic Egypt. And this continues on for a little while longer. Now remember, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar were also rivals of each other. Now in their rivalry and their war between them, which is kind of a civil war between the three, basically Julius Caesar is the one that comes out victorious at the end. Now, if you fast forwarding another, let's see, like 20 years, as Julius Caesar is now a little older and middle-aged, um, um, this is when now we have the story of Cleopatra. Now, of course, Cleopatra the Seventh is the famous Cleopatra. She's the one the story is quite well known historically, that she enters into a romantic relationship with Julius Caesar, thinking that she's going to marry him and they're going to somehow unify the Romans and the Egyptians, and he's going to become like some kind of an emperor, and she's going to become, Miss Empress, thinking that she's going to unite the Ptolemies and the Egyptians into a single empire. And remember, the Roman population would have been very much against that, obviously, because the population within now the Rome itself, and then now the would have been very anti Cleopatra. But eventually, basically, uh, Julius Caesar, because of his ambitions of becoming an emperor, he's killed by the Senate, of course, in around 44 BC. So 44 BC, he's killed, and then Cleopatra is left without an ally until uh, there's the war between um, Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted nephew, and Mark Antony, the powerful Mark Antony, who takes over basically much of the well, actually, Mark Octavian ends up with much of the legions and the navy. Mark Antony enters into a romantic relationship with Cleopatra and uses Cleopatra's navy. And there's a very, very large battle around 30 BC in an area of Greece. Oh, I can't get any closer, but near the island north of like where Lefkada is today, in the Ambracian Gulf, there's an ancient city called Actium or Action in ancient Greece, and offshore was an enormous battle between the forces of Mark Antony and the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra allied with each other, and Octavian on the other side. And Octavian wins. So Mark Antony and Cleopatra lose the war, and then Mark Antony he commits suicide, and then Cleopatra commits suicide by allowing herself to be bitten by a poisonous snake, an Egyptian asp, that supposedly was hidden in a basket of dates that her servant served her. So she killed herself on purpose, bitten by a snake, which also, remember, that also fulfills the prophecy going all the way back to the time of Moses. Remember when Moses' staff turns into a serpent, but then the Pharaoh's staff also, with the magicians, turn it into a serpent, but then Moses' staff eats the Pharaoh's, the one from Pharaoh, because that's showing that eventually, look at how the Pharaohs end, because now Cleopatra, once we get to around 30 BC, um, Cleopatra was the last Greek pharaoh and the last of all of the pharaohs, going all the way back to the beginning of Egyptian history. So when she dies, that's the end of pharaonic Egypt, that's the end of Ptolemaic Greek Egypt, and Egypt gets annexed by Octavian. Octavian becomes Octavian becomes Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. Eventually, and remember, Octavian is Augustus Caesar, the first emperor. And of course, now culturally, of course, nothing changes in this area. It's still the same Greek speaking. There's very little influence of Latin in the Greek speaking areas. But because basically everything stays the same the way it was, the same Hellenistic culture. Nothing really changes except that now everybody's under Roman rule. But now Egypt becomes a Roman province, now with a governor. So now you can see that's how this area very briefly, that's how the Mediterranean gets conquered by the Romans. Uh, uh, I mean, this video is kind of a mouthful because it's kind of hard to summarize the entire conquest of the Mediterranean in one video. But but I didn't want to like draw it out too much. But in the next video, I'm going to discuss now what some of the problems within the Judeans, and especially the sectarian among the Judeans during the Hasmonean Civil War and during the time when the Romans were coming in. What was going on within the Judeans culturally at this point, and in terms of sectarianism. But that's all for now. Doxa Toseo.